Hi everyone, I'm Julianna Lee from the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. Thank you for being here. My update will be on the Family Law Court with a focus on the process for filing domestic violence restraining orders. Since March, there have been several court orders on court operations in response to COVID-19. They're listed here and available on the LA Superior Court website. I'll refer to some of them as we go on. So, what is the status of the family court? There have been many orders from government officials in the courts, and with the tightening of shelter-at-home orders, it's not surprising that many people believe the courts are closed. That may be at least one reason why, at least initially during this pandemic, domestic violence restraining order filing numbers were down. It's true, the court is mostly closed. The court's April 14th order set the closure period for the court until May 12th. Important for us, the court is open for time-sensitive, essential functions. For family law, that means temporary restraining order applications, restraining order hearings, family law ex partes, and Hague Convention cases. For everything else in family law, the court is closed. One can still file new divorce and paternity cases, request custody and support modifications, and file other pleadings, but the court is not going to act on them and hold hearings during the closure period. The Family Court Services Office that provides mediation is also closed. It's possible the court will again extend the closure period, but we won't know until we're much closer to the May 12th date. A note on the non-essential function hearings and matters before we get to the DV restraining order updates. Except for the essential function matters, if you have a hearing for a family law case during the closure period, it will be continued. For those matters, the court is reviewing all pending cases and new filings and placing them in priority categories. The highest priority is for matters involving physical safety. So matters involving safety and well-being, particularly of children, will take priority over hearings on such issues as division of property and status hearings. But remember, if it's not an essential functions case, no matter its priority, it is at least for the moment on hold. The ramp update for LA Superior Court as a whole is tentatively set for June 22nd. That's the date the court plans to resume quote-unquote normal operations, but it will be far from normal. There will be an extended transition period and the court will continue to observe social distancing. Now let's turn to the domestic violence restraining order process and how that looks under this pandemic. So there's no change to the forms and content of requesting a domestic violence restraining order or to the formal standards for granting them. Because the courts are mostly closed, court-based assistance for restraining orders, so that's self-help centers and domestic violence clinics, are now remote. The vast majority of the court's clerical staff are also working from home, and clerical assignments at the courthouse rotate and change weekly. This means both the steps of preparing a restraining order application and having it processed by the court are taking longer than before. It takes longer to prepare and review forms by phone. Fax filing is not always reliable, and whereas survivors could often receive a temporary restraining order the same day as filing before the pandemic, that is not always the case under the current closure. As a result, there are delays, and survivors should seek an emergency protective order through law enforcement if they need protection and more time to file for a domestic violence restraining order. Under the Judicial Council's emergency rules, emergency protective orders can now be issued for up to 30 days, and survivors should specifically request a 30-day emergency protective order to account for various delays. In the next several slides, we'll review the following updates to the domestic violence restraining order process. As we all know, these are extraordinary times, and unsurprisingly, a lot has changed at the courts too. A word of caution before I begin. Los Angeles has the largest trial court system in the country with numerous courthouses. These are general updates. But you and any survivors should be aware that there may be some local variation. Follow-up and additional diligence is probably best practice. So, you've completed a domestic violence restraining order application. Now you need to file it. All right, there are two ways. One is in person at the courthouse. Outside the courthouse, there are two lines or options: the Case on Calendar Today line and a line for the drop box. DV restraining order applicants should go into the Case on Calendar Today line. Do not submit domestic violence restraining order applications via the outside drop box. That'll lead likely to delays. Once the application is submitted with the court, leave your best contact information with the clerk so the court can contact you when your paperwork is ready. The second option is fax filing, which can be a good remote option. It's not always a smooth process, but it's for now the only remote filing option for domestic violence restraining order applications. Some things to keep in mind for fax filing: you need to include the court's fax cover sheet. Don't worry about filing fees or page limits. After you file the application, the court should respond back via fax. That is a policy of the court and should be automatic. But if you don't hear within one business day, it's a good idea to call the court and follow up. 2 general points about filing. The court will accept electronic signatures for domestic violence restraining order applications. And if possible, filing earlier in the day will increase your chances of receiving your processed domestic violence restraining order papers, hopefully including a temporary restraining order that day. Now, a bit of good news. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is continuing to assist with service for restraining order cases. The sheriff's offices in the courts should still be open for service requests. If they're not, or if you fax file, you can request assistance with service via email. In the email, you should include copies of your granted temporary restraining order, the notice of hearing, and your domestic violence restraining order application packet, along with the sheriff's service request form. It's always hard to get people to answer their door, and even harder in a pandemic, but personal service is still required despite the additional challenges. If you're unable to obtain personal service, you may still be able to proceed with the case by requesting alternative service, such as by first-class mail to the respondent's home or place of employment. This is an option when there is some indication that the respondent is evading service and you've exhausted all your options to have the other party personally served. So unlike the continuances that the courts are issuing on their own for non-essential function matters, continuances for domestic violence restraining order hearings are not automatic. Thus, even if parties just want a continuance of their hearing, they still need to appear in some way to make that request unless one has already been granted prior to the hearing date. The court is liberally granting continuances to minimize public health risks, but it's also proceeding with hearings in cases where justice demands them. Now that courts can extend temporary restraining orders for up to an additional 90 days, the wait time for a hearing can be substantial. So when might justice warrant proceeding with a hearing? It could arise if the court didn't grant a temporary restraining order at the time of filing, but waiting 3 months for a decision on the domestic violence restraining order is too long. Or if the court does grant a temporary restraining order that imposes strong restrictions on the respondent, think a move-out order or a no visitation order with one's children. A note on interpretation services. The court should still be providing an interpreter either in person or remotely for all hearings. If anyone has had problems with this, please let me know. It doesn't appear that the court has done a lot of outreach regarding its orders and updates to the many Angelinos for whom English is not their first language. This raises serious concerns about access to the courts for communities that may be particularly vulnerable during this pandemic. Now you have to appear for a domestic violence restraining order hearing. You have 3 options here. The first is going to the courthouse in person. If you go to court for your hearing, go early and be prepared for additional security and screening measures. The court's March 23rd order restricts access to the courthouse and only permits parties to a case, attorneys, witnesses, and authorized persons to enter. A support person for a domestic violence survivor is an authorized person. The court does not want anyone to bring minor children into the courthouse, but if it's necessary, the court should admit them as well. The courts have consolidated domestic violence restraining order hearings to a small number of courtrooms. If the assigned courtroom is closed, you should ask a clerk where the cases for that courtroom have been reassigned. Making an in-person appearance is for the most part the same as before and relatively straightforward. But of course, it involves risks of exposure that everyone is trying to keep at a minimum. Remote appearance options are obviously safer, but they also present financial and logistical challenges for low-income survivors. There are two remote options. The first is court call. Court call is the vendor contracted with the court to provide telephonic appearances. There are several steps to using court call. First, you have to file a telephonic request form, the FL 679, with the court. You don't need to file this 12 court days in advance, as the form indicates, but the sooner the better. The cost for court call is $54 per appearance, which is prohibitive for many of our clients. To waive the fee, you need to file two sets of fee waiver requests. The FW 001 form is the filing fee waiver request. It must be approved before you can request the additional fee waiver, the form FW 002, and because that is required to waive the court call fee. Once you have the fee waivers in place, you need to contact court call to set up and confirm the phone appearance and to provide a copy of the approved fee waiver. The other remote option is to appear via video using a platform called WebEx. Currently, WebEx is only available in two family law courtrooms, Departments 18 and 22 in the Stanley Moss Courthouse. You can access it via a computer and smartphone. There are safety and confidentiality concerns we should consider before survivors agree to appear via WebEx. If WebEx works well and there is sufficient demand, the court may expand this capability to other courtrooms and courthouses. Okay, that's it for domestic violence restraining order updates. But one final note about ex parte or emergency family law matters. Ex parte family law matters are among the court's essential functions for which the court is open. Ex parte applications can now be filed via a resource account, which is just an email address set up by the court only for the purposes of filing ex parte applications. Please note, these resource account email addresses cannot be used for domestic violence restraining order applications. Also a note that generally, ex parte family law requests are difficult to get granted because there is a very high bar for what the law views as an emergency. It requires there to be either an immediate harm to the child or an immediate risk of an out-of-state abduction. Thank you very much for listening, and if you know any domestic violence survivors who need assistance, please share this information. Encourage them to call the domestic violence hotline at the number here, 1-800-399-4529, extension 8097. Following here, you will see there's information in the appendix. There are here resource account email addresses, a list of domestic violence legal resources, self-help resources, court fax filing numbers, and the Sheriff Department's service request form. Again, my contact information is here. Please feel to reach out if you have questions. You can also refer any survivors to our hotline and refer any individuals seeking assistance with family law and other civil legal matters to the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles.